Good afternoon. So this subject, the future frontiers of strategic infrastructure, is of great interest, I think, in terms of some of the developments around the world. As all of you know, throughout history, infrastructure investment has proven to have not only financial, but geopolitical impacts. This is even more so today with the compounding impacts of globalization and technology. In my experience, there are many motivations, and this goes for both domestic and international projects, objectives and therefore consequences to infrastructure development, most of them generally positive. Something I feel strongly about is the minimizing of political risk and influence on infrastructure projects. How does the international community bring the 10 organizations, there are at least 10 I know about today, the World Bank, IFC, United Nations, the G20, 5 multilaterals, and us here at the World Economic Forum, all of us study infrastructure development together to manage political risk issues and agree on state-of-the-art best practices. A much debated topic to be sure, and one I'm confident our keynote speaker for today's panel, Dr. Chipman, Director General and Chief Executive of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, will provide extraordinary insights into. I'm intrigued by Dr. Chipman's position that corporations themselves require a foreign policy, a notion typically held only for nations. With a BA from Harvard, an MA for distinction from the London School of Economics, and a Master's in Philosophy from Balliol College, Oxford, Dr. Chipman is well-schooled in the areas of international relations, regional security, and political risk. He has developed IISS as the Global Institute on Intergovernmental Dynamics. The questions we've put to the panel: what are the strategic implications of today's global infrastructure projects? And there's a big one, and it is evident this question cannot be answered without a high level of concentration on the Belt and Road Initiative, what we call the BRI, a multi-billion, 60-country ambitious infrastructure development plan. In addition, with us today are two of the brightest minds in infrastructure finance and international relations. Ms. Abha Joshi-Ghani, Director for Knowledge and Learning at the World Bank, is an expert on infrastructure finance and urban development in East Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Before joining the World Bank, she worked for the Reserve Bank of India. She holds a Master of Philosophy from Oxford University and a Master's from Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. Our second panelist, Dr. Xuetong, is Dean of International Relations at Tsinghua University. Named one of the top 100 intellectuals by the American Journal of Foreign Policy, he's also adjunct professor at the National Defense University and a senior research fellow with the National Security Committee, just to name a few of his appointments. Dr. Yan holds a PhD in political science from the University of California and a master's in international relations. So let's get on with our in-depth discussion. So over to you, Dr. Chipman.
John Beck, thank you very much indeed. So let me just start by asserting that obviously the Marshall Plan of the late 1940s and the early 1950s is the paradigm for how infrastructure investment can have strategic impact. And today, any discussion of strategic infrastructure quickly turns to the BRI. It's now a little more than 5 years since President Xi Jinping announced what was to become the BRI, and 1 year after the 19th Congress of the Communist Party of China actually incorporated the BRI into its constitution. The BRI at first found an enthusiastic audience internationally, given the enormous infrastructure needs of the BRI geographies. President Xi cast the BRI in a multilateral narrative and focused on the contribution to globalization that strengthening connectivity between Asia, the Middle East, and Europe would make. China took an inclusive approach to participation in the BRI, in contrast perhaps to the Marshall Plan. It created the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank with international participation, which appeared, at least at the time, to be Beijing's chosen vehicle for financing BRI. China's focus on hard infrastructure in the low-income and developing economies in the BRI geography stretches, as you can see, from Southeast Asia to South and Central Asia to the Middle East and Eastern and Central Europe. This was welcome, given the lack of support for such projects by the multilateral development banks and Western donors, and by the fact that Chinese projects did not come with sensitive conditions around governance and policy. BRI was not, of course, China's first venture into infrastructure development, but rather built on a quarter of a century of experience, if piecemeal, in Africa. Now, China has avoided describing the BRI in strategic terms. It has especially objected to any comparisons of BRI with the so-called imperialistic Marshall Plan. Nevertheless, for China, it appears that there were three strategic goals in initiating BRI. The first was domestically driven, to create more energetic growth in South and Central Asia that would also support economic development and stability in Western China, a long-standing interest for Beijing. And for this reason, Pakistan became the most important partner in BRI, providing an alternative northern pathway linking China's west and its western state neighbors to key global sea lanes, especially through the port facilities at Gwadar. The centrality of Pakistan to the initiative has had, of course, the geopolitical knock-on effect of irritating India that generally opposes the BRI. The second strategic goal was to put China in the lead of new finance and global rule and norm setting. On the finance side, the aim has been to broaden the global role of China's currency, the renminbi. While a manufacturing and trade leviathan, of course, China continues to play well under its weight as a global financial force, despite symbolic gains such as the renminbi being included within the IMF's basket of currencies that comprise the SDR. On the rule and norm setting side is the digital Silk Road, which aims to construct communication networks across the developing world. China is looking to build fiber optic cables, international trunk passageways, mobile structures, and e-commerce links. These technologies are designed to supplement the Belt and Road's physical infrastructure while introducing common technical standards in participating nations, most of which lack rudimentary internet facilities. China is building optical fiber cable projects linking Beijing to Myanmar, Nepal, and Kyrgyzstan. It is also installing 5G mobile technology, a central component of China's digital economy across a wide swathe of BRI countries under the digital Silk Road. The third goal was to rebalance China's regional footprint, which had been focused eastward and southward to China's west. This Go West element was partly in response to the US pivot to Asia initiated by President Obama. The original geopolitics of BRI was not designed to confront the United States, but to build up China's influence without generating conflict with Washington by focusing on geographies seen as of limited or declining importance to the US. And as the BRI gained momentum, it grew more nationalist and self-confident in its implementation. AIIB did not become a substantial financial player in BRI. Ironically, its largest portfolio, not BRI related, is in fact in India. For BRI, Chinese state banks, the China Development Bank and the China Exim Bank took the lead, working almost exclusively with Chinese firms and state-owned enterprises. European interest in the BRI began to fade as European firms failed to find sufficient opportunities for engagement in BRI projects, and more significantly, of course, the initial skepticism that BRI encountered in Washington turned to active criticism. Media coverage of the BRI recently has become decidedly negative as substantial debt repayment and financial sustainability issues emerged in several BRI countries. Implementation challenges also arose across the board, and the BRI became an issue in the domestic politics of several countries, especially in Southeast Asia. So China is vulnerable to the anti-corruption themes that have begun to mark recent populist nationalist movements in a number of countries in the developing world. When Xi hosted the initial BRI summit in May 2017, which I was honored to attend, Kenya's President Kenyatta was virtually the only leader to criticize China's approach. But recently, there have been growing concerns within BRI states that the terms of their deals with China provide too many of the benefits to China while the recipients bear the brunt of the risk. There is now more concern, especially in Washington, on the vulnerabilities that both countries and companies might face should China's digital Silk Road activities lead it to control, look at that map, the ICT sectors in the nearly 60 countries in which it is invested. Now, Malaysian Prime Minister Mahathir went so far as to describe the BRI as a new colonialism, exactly the opposite of what the Chinese initially intended. Even Pakistan, which has drawn much closer to Beijing as its ties with the US have weakened, has raised some concerns about BRI. Islamabad has cut back on the scale of the Karachi-Peshawar Railroad project, a major element of BRI's China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, and many in Pakistan think CPEC should stand on its own merit and perhaps be separated from the BRI umbrella. The BRI's focus on ports, obviously a dual-use infrastructure, may also have a huge strategic impact. China is involved in port projects across all of the BRI geographies, and of particular interest now are its efforts in Myanmar, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Djibouti, Kenya, and Mozambique. And Beijing's port development in the Indian Ocean periphery does worry Indian defense specialists who developed famously the string of pearls theory, which posed that China was attempting to encircle India and threaten its own power projection, trade, and potentially even its territorial integrity. Now, clearly, China gains so-called access benefits through these ports, facilitating maritime routes into the Middle East and Africa and north through Pakistan into Central Asia. Now, while China argues that BRI is the financial and economic expression of Beijing's approach of win-win diplomacy, a counter-narrative has begun to emerge that BRI is debt trap diplomacy, i.e. that Beijing is intentionally using BRI to gain control over strategic assets, especially in South and Southeast Asia. And Exhibit A of the current debt trap argument is Sri Lanka, where the government had to sign over Hambantota port on a 99-year lease after it couldn't meet its $1.2 billion debt commitments for the construction of what Bloomberg called a $1 billion white element. Now, naturally, China itself holds a virtuous cycle view of the relationship between infrastructure development, economic growth, and domestic and regional political stability. Debt for equity is probably not a BRI strategic goal and could in many cases, of course, be an unwelcome result of BRI investment that China would wish to avoid. But the reality is that infrastructure development in countries with weak institutions and substantial corruption is, of course, difficult. It demands greater planning, longer timelines. And in fact, the emergence of difficult debt dynamics in at least 6 to 8 BRI countries has substantial parallels to the African debt crisis of the 1980s, which was a function of a sharp increase in lending in difficult development circumstances rather than an intentional effort by creditors to weaken debtors. Now, the US has responded to China's BRI successes and difficulties by adopting a more explicitly hostile stance. The Trump administration has also recognized that BRI is, of course, a strategic reality affecting regional security calculations. And in his recent speech indicting Beijing for a raft of sins, Vice President Pence spoke of the constricting belt and the one-way road in describing the impact of BRI. And President Trump recently signed into law the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act, laying out a more active US policy in what Washington now calls, of course, the Indo-Pacific. But the ARIA financial resources will pale in comparison to China's commitments to BRI. Meanwhile, the IMF has said it will not allow its program resources to be used for the repayment of bad project debt to China. Given the fungibility of financial resources, this policy will mean that recipients of IMF programs will not be allowed to make any repayments to Beijing on bad BRI loans. The fund is now closely monitoring debt liabilities created by BRI projects and has pressured governments against accepting projects that might have risky financial implications. Now, China, for its part, has responded to these challenges in several ways. It has scaled back substantially on new project initiation under BRI and slowed down the pace of implementation. Beijing has now established for the first time a foreign aid agency, the China International Development Cooperation Agency, and it appears that CIDCA will be given responsibility for ensuring greater coherence in China's BRI activities, a function that had previously not existed. BRI has now been given political oversight by a small leading group chaired by one of the 7 members of the Standing Committee of the Communist Party, though it does not yet actually have even its own secretariat, extraordinary for a $1.5 trillion project. China also appears to be cultivating new partners. On his Middle East visit last summer, Xi's first stop was Abu Dhabi, and UAE-China BRI cooperation has now been formalized. When President Xi hosted Prime Minister Abe in Beijing a couple of months ago, the main ancillary event was the so-called Joint China-Japan Third Country Infrastructure Investment Conference, quite a mouthful, but it was clear that China appeared to be seeking Japanese collaboration in investment sharing, program implementation skills, and quality control. And it's not clear yet what practical projects will ensue from this, but China-Japan elective cooperation on BRI infrastructure is, I think, very much worth watching. So, to conclude, what are the strategic implications of China's infrastructure investments through BRI? Let me make 6 quick points. First, the US-China trade dispute, a weakening domestic economy, and challenges to BRI have led to a pricking of the triumphalism bubble around China's geoeconomic outlook. There is nothing inevitable about China's continued rise to economic dominance, nor about the superiority of its authoritarian governance model that supports BRI. Second, China's ability to build its influence and power through BRI still depends on the existence of a broadly enabling global environment. So China retains an important stake in global order. BRI's focus on creating global public goods, infrastructure development, provides Beijing with the legitimacy to reverse the traditional pattern of commerce following the flag, i.e. to create economic interdependencies that Beijing believes will enhance its external influence without a direct military role. But as the Sri Lanka port controversy highlights, BRI's legitimacy is very much vulnerable to reputational risk. Third, BRI is expanding the range of geographies where Chinese equities might be threatened and need to be defended. Most important are the Turkic countries of Central Asia, where Chinese actions against its own Uyghur population are beginning to drive some Islamist radicals to take on a more anti-Beijing focus. Such an expansion of security requirements will bring its own choices for China. China's extraordinary rate of economic growth is declining in a secular, not a cyclical fashion. As President Xi's recent speech suggested, Taiwanese unification remains China's principal security goal. But the defense investments needed to facilitate that, anti-access technologies to limit US options in the region, will have to compete with the more expeditionary military needs created by a far-flung BRI that might need to be defended. Fourth, while Pakistan currently holds pride of place in BRI because of its perceived link to Chinese domestic issues, if Beijing is really trying to create a China-centric economic zone through BRI, the key geography will in fact be Southeast Asia. That is also where BRI is now facing the most political pushback. Whether China will be able to woo to its side middle powers such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand is therefore a big question. Fifth, the digital Silk Road is poised to become a bigger focal point in the China-US technology standoff as the next generation 5G data networks begin to be rolled out. The US and some like-minded countries are seeking to exclude Chinese 5G equipment makers from their networks, and China appears ready to insist that major BRI recipients use only Chinese 5G suppliers. Finally, might BRI evolve? China appears to be moving towards more prudent lending, paying greater attention to execution risks, as well as seeking partners for funding BRI. There would be additional benefits if these unilateral moves were expanded to include the adoption of international creditor norms, engagement with the London and Paris debt restructuring procedures, and, of course, enhanced transparency. That positive outcome is not a given. It's perhaps unlikely, but I think it's worth noting as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that dynamic presentation, Dr. Chipman. And now I'd like to turn the floor over to Ms. Joshi-Ghani for her thoughts. Will be followed by Dr. Yan.
Lovely. Thank you, John. And thank you, John, for your terrific presentation. I think it really puts the geopolitical and strategic role of BRI right at the center of things. But I wanted to just step back a little and situate the BRI and strategic infrastructure in what is actually happening in the world on infrastructure and the sustainable development goals and the kind of infrastructure gap that we have today. That might give us some perspective or a different perspective. So today we have about 940 million people in the world that lack electricity. There are 660 million which lack drinking water. 2.4 billion don't have improved sanitation. 1 billion lack a connection to a proper passable road. And so it's really, really important for development reasons that we narrow this infrastructure gap globally. And there are numbers which are floating around, and I think the number which is most common is that we need $1 trillion a year to actually meet that infrastructure gap until 2030. And we know that public finances as they exist today cannot meet this gap. We also know that multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the EBRD, the Asian Development Bank, et cetera, cannot meet this alone. And we do need to bring the private sector in, and we also need governance and strong institutions and all of that put together. But let's just focus on the Belt and Road Initiative. And John mentions rightly that the impact of this initiative is huge. And why is that? Because if we look at the BRI countries, there are 65 countries in the Belt Road Initiative, and they account for 30% of the world's GDP. They also account for 62% of the world population, and they account for 75% of the world's energy reserves. So this is not a joke in terms of the impact that BRI could actually have if there is governance around it and if the institutions are right. So let me just come to that. So we understand that BRI has the capacity for transformational growth. I'll just put 3 opportunities and 3 risks in the context of BRI. So one opportunity is, of course, the formidable and tremendous scope of the project itself in terms of the countries involved, GDPs, and trade. Second is the potential second is the unexploited potential. So we've seen that the trade has grown in the region by about 30%, or it has actually doubled in the last 20 years. Most of it is led by China, but we also know that countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Central Asian countries are way below the impact they could have in trade or how they could participate in trade. So that is an opportunity which lies there. The third opportunity is that of connectivity. So we talked about digital connectivity, which I think is your institute is the one which has come out with the 5G digital road. But also connectivity in terms of trade. So today it takes China 30 days to ship its goods to Europe. If a rail and a road ring link was built to Europe, it would take them 10 days. And the reduction of 1 day in trade, in export or import, leads to actually 1% of increase in trade. So you can just see the impact, the opportunity the BRI could have. But we also have major risks, and I'll point out 3 big risks for that. Remind me if I'm going over time, John. Very quickly, thick policy barriers. So you can have all kind of infrastructure connectivity between countries, but if your policies are not in place, if your customs are difficult, then what we call thick policy barriers or sticky custom regulations will not let you get the benefits of that infrastructure investment or connectivity. And we understand that most of these countries have very, very thick policy barriers. For example, it takes 50 days to export or import goods out of Central Asia, and about 10 days in G7 countries. So you can see the amount of policy and regulatory reform that's required. Second big risk is in these large projects that you're bound to neglect the environmental and social and governance aspects of infrastructure. So are we risking mangroves? Are we risking biodiversity because of a haphazard application of environmental safeguards? And what about the social impact? Because spatial or economic agglomeration always causes some cities or countries to lose and some to win. So how do we make sure that there's equitable spatial impact of this? And the third one, which John mentioned a number of times, is the macro-fiscal, which is huge impact on the fiscal capacity of countries. So we already heard about the port in Sri Lanka not being able to pay, or the road which goes between, it's a highway to Singapore where Laos is supposed to put in $6 billion, and that is 40% of its GDP. So there's huge macro-fiscal problems. But what I wanted to end with is to say that that big infrastructure projects, cross-regional with strategic impact, can be done well if they are done with strong institutions, right policy, and right governance and transparency. And one last point, John. We're talking about this integration. I just wanted to give an example of South Asia's integration. So inter-country trade in East Asia accounts for about 60% of East Asian trade. In South Asia, it's only 5% of trade. So you can imagine the amount of potential that South Asia can gain if there was regional connectivity through infrastructure and custom borders. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abha. That was extremely interesting. Feeling the other side of what we've seen on the screen, I think, is important to know where we might get closer to some balance. So possibly on that note,
okay,
Professor Yan.
I just make 2 points. And the first, I think both in China and the foreign countries, and people try to understand BRI from the map, right? It's same, not here in China, same. And the second is that, and the BRI seemed to me, and people talking about BRI, they said that they know what it is. My understanding, the first, BRI can never be understood from the map. And it's easy to draw a line on the map, but not that easy. You try to build a real one on the earth. And you all know that the problem is not what kind of, how modern the railway you build. The question is that how can you maintain the railway work? How can you make the train running on it safely? How can you make the train run on it profitably? And I think technicians there know that. And maintain these facilities requires technology, money, salary, and everything. So when these facilities, I mean the infrastructure building in the developing countries, most of the developing countries, they have no capital, no technology, no technicians. How can they make these facilities work? So when you come to the reality, you find that now the BRI, the project of BRI is not the line on the map. It's something totally different from the line. Second, what is BRI? From my understanding, the concept of BRI changed frequently from the very beginning. And this idea was publicly announced in 2013, 6 years. At that time, it only means to develop more trade and economic cooperation between China and the Central Asian countries. Later on, it becomes bigger, and then concerning develop the maritime relationship with the ASEAN countries. Well, and then they use the term strategy. Like John said that. Later on said, no, this is not strategy. China cannot force other government to implement a Chinese strategy. That's impossible. So they said, we cannot use the term because you need cooperation from the other side, and the other side have the willing to do that. So they said, no, we changed the term from the strategy to initiative. That's why we have BRI today. Okay, it's become initiative, but then they're still talking about the infrastructure, mainly the transportation. But now then they find that, hey, wait a minute, is a BRI, how far it goes? Just now, John gave the map and actually not go beyond to Latin American. Actually, China already have some Latin Americans sign the contract with them, and and so the BRI goes everywhere. You don't know where's the line. From the Beijing to where? Seems to me to everywhere. So then it's no longer one belt, one road. It's so many belts and so many roads, but you just don't know where do they link with each other. So my understanding, I totally agree with John, all these problems and the difficulties faced by the BRI project, and then, very possible, the government is going to adjust the policy toward the BRI. The content of the BRI possibly change. I'm not so sure the government will heavily focus on the transportation facility infrastructures for next 10 years. They may give a priority to something else. Like John said, maybe go to the 5G. So that means something in sky, not on the earth, not on the land. So my understanding, the BRI have changed from the very beginning, and then it will continue to going to change. So I would say, and I doubt anyone can predict what the BRI will be in the next 10 years.
So I attended a conference a year ago at the World Bank where I met some representatives of the BRI plan, and I was assured that the proper governance, the proper need for social license, the proper inclusion of the recipient countries would be honored. And then, of course, we see Sri Lanka being the latest example, that is not exactly how it has proceeded. So there may be a lot of benefits to what has been happening with BRI, but the perception is that those benefits have been outweighed by some of the negative consequences. So Abha, what do you think about the governance aspects of BRI and how it's perceived and how we might be able to improve that?
So John, it is an important point that governance really shapes how your infrastructure is financed and how it performs, and whether we are able to then have citizens access services or not. And I think just looking at governance, we find that it's not just a matter of countries within the BRI, but generally in both developed and developing countries. We find that governance is more or less seen as lack of corruption and transparency, but it is way more than that. It starts with firstly, it starts with the right leadership, with a strategic investment plan for your investment, what should be prioritized, what should not be. Clear, transparent processes of procuring and implementing, and very importantly, stakeholder consultation, and that stakeholder, civil society, citizens, private sector, and other institutions. And we find that unless governance is situated in terms of institutional capacity, capacity of people to implement, we cannot see successful infrastructure projects which benefit the broad swaths of population that they are supposed to benefit. So I would actually say that the infrastructure gap is not a finance gap, it's a governance gap.
Professor Yan, do you think, looking at everything and what's on the screen, some of the comments now, some of the media reports, do you think that maybe China has not fully appreciated how much sensitivity there would be with their program, and do you think that they're changing as a result of that?
Well, I think definitely the government will adjust its policy toward these projects according to all of these changes or unexpected changes. And I just visited Pakistan in the last year and to have a look about this these constructions. And I found that many things is beyond my expectation. And now when you use the map, you see, okay, including the Chinese government, say, we have 90 countries signed a contract, so they look at the number of the country, the population of the country put together is account for 1/3 of population of the world. When you come to that country, the people say, wait a minute. That project only benefit for small group people. The 90% of people in this country cannot benefit from the project. So not the whole country, just a small spot. And then that causes a problem. Why? The people and opposing the government say that, now look at that, this government is so bad, they use Chinese money only for the region support him. And he do not share anything for us. So the people hate this project because they cannot benefit from it. You lend the money to them, you build the infrastructure, makes the local people benefit, and then you didn't realize that their neighbors hate that. Then you make more enemies. And the thing is that no matter democratic country or not, the government will change. So all the parties not hold the power will against anything suggested by the government. So the Chinese government have to reach an agreement with the government instead of with the opposition parties. So then what? These people, medias, they all against you. So from my understanding, these projects are involved politically into the local politics.
Social license.
Yeah, that's the social problems, so very serious.
Dr. Chipman, so it was interesting watching these slides and the growth and the expansion of the influences and so on. You've been working at this for many years. Do you sense an acceleration or deceleration, or what do you sense in terms of the movement of all of this?
Well, first, three things. I'm delighted to hear Professor Yan endorse my sense that also in China there's quite a debate about what's the geographic and geoeconomic extent of the BRI. And I was just at a BRI session a couple of hours ago where a Chinese gentleman said there were 120 countries involved in the BRI. It started off at 60, then it became 90, now 120. And you're quite right that a lot of Chinese state-owned enterprises felt that if they were interested in doing something, they want to badge it as BRI, because this was part of the President Xi's Great China Dream. So the small leading group in China, soon after the BRI was announced, got something like 4,000 projects. Everything was called BRI, just in the hope that it would get national support. So my first point is I think that first, China is alert to the challenge of economic and financial overstretch. The state-owned enterprises will be having their own directors' meetings wondering about whether their balance sheets can cope with this. They will have been struck by the backlash in a place like Malaysia that cancelled $22 billion worth of projects, and alert to the reality that domestic political sentiment could so radically change. I think Professor Yan is right that the Chinese government will adapt to this and be perhaps more prudent, more cautious. And as I ended begin bringing in other partners. And of course, those other partners might bring with them certain conditions on governance, transparency, and the like that could shape the BRI in a different direction. I think the one area where the BRI activity will continue to be very intense will be in what China has styled and the outside world has styled the digital Silk Road. That's why I spent quite a bit of time building those slides. There's 58 countries there, and the future of infrastructure is a lot in the digital space. And look, we're sitting here at the WEF, Fourth Industrial Revolution, high tech. It's in that 5G fiber optics world where China will want to make an irreversible impact. And it's where also the geopolitical issues will become, I think, even more stark.
And we're reading all about that in the media these days, for sure. I think it's time to open it up for questions. So we welcome any questions or comments from the audience. Please, ma'am.
My name is
Hang on, you're going to get a mic. Okay.
Hi, my name is Amy Webb.
And, please tell us who you'd like to direct the question to.
Sure, it's for everybody.
And tell us who you are.
Sure, my name is Amy Webb. I'm a quantitative futurist, and I'm a professor at NYU Stern School of Business in the US. So my question, because my area is AI, my question is, in the digital Silk Road, as it's being built, to what extent you think harvesting, mining, refining, and productizing data, and making that data mandatory and accessible by Beijing is a central part of building out the digital infrastructure, and what, say, the 58 and counting countries will have, and what real leverage they may or may not have over how their citizens' data can be used.
Who wants to answer that?
Yeah, I mean, on that, I think a lot of countries, including in the developed world, have only recently woken up to how much Chinese 5G technology is in their infrastructure. The State Minister of the Interior of Germany told me a couple of weeks ago that they just realized that 50% of Deutsche Telekom is Huawei. That was not something that they were alert to. As you know, the Five Eyes countries, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the United States, have been very alert to this issue. And 4 out of those 5 have basically pressed the pause, nearly the stop button on Huawei Chinese investment in 5G. For the moment, the UK is still looking at it. Interestingly, GCHQ, our signals intelligence agency, has for several years conditioned Huawei investment on them approving the technology and feeling that it was as secure as it reasonably could be. One of the interesting ancillary effects of that supervisory role was that several weeks ago, GCHQ, looking at the coding of Huawei infrastructure, just found that there was bad code in it and said that they wanted to see $2 billion of investment in order to clean up the code to make it good. And Huawei assented to that request because they wanted, if possible, to stay in. In direct answer to your main question, I do think there will be a likelihood that at least in all those 58 countries where fiber optic cables, e-commerce particularly, all of these investments are being made, they'll be able to harvest that. And China is the global superpower in big data analytics, and they've just got access to 58 more countries potentially.
Any other comments before we go to the next question?
Well, I have no knowledge about technology, but politically, from my understanding, the technology competition and decided by the advantage of that technology rather than by anything else. So that's why when the world, only the US have the GPS, everyone knows that GPS is invented by American military, and they control everything. They can use the GPS, control all of the other kinds of military. Then what? All of these other countries still use GPS. In China today, we still have the taxi driver use that, but so certainly very soon they're going to use the Beidou and no longer the GPS. We use the 5G instead of the 4G. So my understanding that in the future, this is not decided by the political factors. It's decided by the technology itself.
Next question.
So I mean that as long as the 5G is really available and cheaper and more advanced than the other technology, people will use it.
Thank you. Next question? Anyone? Anything? I'll ask the next question then. So, transborder infrastructure isn't only BRI. It's definitely the biggest game in town. But we in Canada are building today a bridge connecting Canada and the US, Windsor and Canada to Detroit in the United States. And that is a $3 billion infrastructure project. There was discussion between the two governments as to who should fund it. And at the end of the day, the American government categorically refused to fund any of it. Canada needs it for trade with the US. The US needs it for trade in Canada. But it was more important for Canada. And Canada is funding the entire project by itself, paid back through tolls over time. So here's another example of trade or economic reasons forcing transborder infrastructure to the benefit maybe more for one country than another. And I, in a way, don't want to call it a CRI, which is Canada, but I do understand the fact that sometimes transborder infrastructure is necessary for successful trade between countries. Don't know what your thoughts might be on that.
If I may just chime in there a bit. No, I think cross-border trade is absolutely important, and we've seen that countries which are geopolitically at odds with each other actually have really suffered from not having cross-border trade, and that's so evident in South Asia. But I also think that this is where, making sure that infrastructure assets are not stranded at the end of the day, where you may build an asset which is excellent for national integration, but the moment you have a cross-border asset, that asset diminishes in value and doesn't contribute as much, and that's a whole lot of waste of funding and other things. But I really feel that in any cross-border trade, that spatial and economic agglomeration should be very much at the center of designing those things.
Well, actually, when we're talking about the transborder transportation, my understanding, there are the three type of transportations, and the air transportation, the maritime transportation, and the land transportation. And it's not difficult for us have this maritime transportation and the air transportation, because all over the world, the air transportation and sea land transportation governed by the global regulations. Unfortunately, the land transportation and governed by every countries. That's why, and you can build a harbor and can build the airports, and you have very little problems. But when you build railways, you will have real problems, because the countries have a different policy to govern the land transportation. It's very difficult to make two countries to reach an agreement to make them the same policy to govern the land transportation, except establish the EU. Some organization, and they give up their sovereignty governing the land transportation, and let the international organization to control that. So nowadays, there's still national sovereignty is the most important power of the governments. I doubt these countries are willing to give up that power.
National sovereignty and national security, I think the two go together. Any further questions? Yes, sir. Don't forget, give us your name and who you're addressing the question to.
My name is Banmali Agrawal. I work for the Tata Group from India. My question is to Ms. Joshi. I think you made a point about private sector investment for infrastructure. Would you say that the appetite for private sector investment in infrastructure has declined over time, particularly in the emerging countries, and even more so during the development phase of an infrastructure project? And would you therefore agree that the role of government ownership of infrastructure and thereby controlling the price, etc., has become even more dominant than it was earlier?
No, absolutely. I mean, I would say that I wouldn't really say that the role of private sector has declined. There was definitely an impact after the 2008 financial crisis, and we saw the World Bank maintains a database called the PPI database, and we saw that private sector investments in infrastructure went down a lot, but they are trending up. But I think where we see that there is still a snag is bringing in pension funds and institutional investors into developing and emerging country economies. So for 2017, as a matter of fact, of the $200 trillion that are owned by pension funds and institutional investors, I think 0.01%, if that, would have flown into developing countries. The figure I do have, and sorry I hesitated there, is that of all the private flows into developing countries in 2017, only 0.7 were accounted by private, like financial institutions. So I think there is and there's no way that we can meet the infrastructure gap without private sector financing. And you're saying, is it that the government should take some of the bigger risk initially of development and so on so that the private sector can come in? And I think that's where public-private partnerships can play a big role, because that's where you see that each party bears the risks it is best situated to bear. So the commercial risk should go to the private sector, the operations and maintenance risk, etc. But maybe the initial development risks, and I've seen in projects where the government took the initial development risk, the risk of pooling together the land and providing all of that projects actually did take off, and we didn't have implementation delays of 7, 8, even 10 years in some cases. So I completely agree with the statement you made that governments do need to come in and, in fact, mitigate the risks that they can to make the sector or the investment attractive for private sector, but at the same time the private sector has to bear all the commercial risks that it would bear if it was a level playing field in terms of political and other risks.
I could just add something to that answer. So we've seen the model as a public-private partnership evolved over some decades, and there's been evolution. And recently there were some failures in the UK, and the public sentiment has swung against public-private partnerships for a while. And I think what's happening there is there's going to be a reshaping of the risk distributions, because some of them might have been too far to one side or too far to the other. I completely agree with Abha when she says you need to put the risk where it is best borne. And I think there'll always be a role for the private sector to contribute to efficiencies, guarantees of schedule, private sector approach to innovation and so on. I think those are valuable additions to infrastructure development. So I think that combination, as it evolves, will continue to work. Other questions? I have one more which I'd like to ask Dr. Chipman for, and that is, I think you mentioned that there was now an exploration by the Chinese government to partner with other countries in continuing some of the BRI, which I think is a good idea because it takes away some of the political sensitivities, let's call it that, and then the partnership, I think, with some Middle Eastern countries. Do you see that as a possible evolution to allow BRI to continue, maybe less controversially?
Yes, I think we're probably entering the third cycle. As I said, the very initial cycle the BRI was put in a multilateral context. Perhaps Beijing was surprised when it established the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank and suddenly find there were 57, 58 countries that became shareholders in it and therefore had some governance role within it. It then went through, as I tried to describe, a sort of 4 or 5 year phase where it was, quite state-owned enterprises going out, doing their thing in as many BRI geographies as possible. Now with these domestic troubles they've had in a few of the geographies, with the question as to whether all of it is money well spent, even from the Chinese perspective, they will, I think, go now through a bit of a multilateral phase. I think the one most interesting to watch would be, will there really be important projects between China and Japan? That was agreed, but I know on the Japanese side they will be hugely vigilant on these governance, transparency, implementation, quality control issues. And if China cooperates with that, then a few quite important projects might well be implemented that otherwise might not be. But if I were to put a marker down for the potential success of a more multilateral approach in BRI, it would be what happens between China and Japan on this.
Right. And that would mean including not only state-owned construction companies from China, but also Japanese companies and maybe Western companies as well. Any other questions? No last questions? Well, then I would ask each one of you to give your closing comments, please. We'll start with Dr. Chipman.
Goodness, well, I won't resile from any of those 6 conclusions or try to come up with 4 or 5 more. I do think that because the BRI is a $1.5 trillion program, everything is about either BRI or what is done instead of BRI. And I think in Europe in particular, there's a lot of questioning now also of some of the BRI activities in the 16 countries or so in the European Union that have been the objects of Chinese affections in this area. We see in Argentina that President Macri had to make a choice between accepting a potential $5 billion Chinese investment or remaining compliant with IMF strictures, and it looks like they chose the latter. So China, seeing these internal debates, I think will take note and, as has so often happened in the past, adapt its behaviors to make it more consistent with what the domestic economic and political markets will bear.
Thank you. Professor Yuan?
Okay. My understanding that besides what John said, that the Chinese government is transferring the bilateral project into a multilateral ones, and also very possibly and to redefine the BRI. And currently we heard that the government said the BRI is an upgrade policy of the opening up. Opening up policy was initiated by Deng Xiaoping in 1978, 40 years ago. So now they said that the BRI is no difference from the Deng Xiaoping's policy, just upgraded. Upgrade to what? That means Deng Xiaoping's policy try to get foreign capital, technician, technology, and foreign investment and products that come to China. But the BRI said we will continue to do that. Meanwhile, we will make the Chinese technology capital and the technician go abroad. It's so-called two-way opening up rather than one way. And the second, when they define the BRI as the upgrade opening up policy, it means that infrastructure is not the core of this. The opening up policy include its comprehensive concept, including everything, including finance and the cultural exchange program, education, and many, many things, much more than the transportation infrastructure. So that means the range, the scope of this concept becomes wider. And the third thing is about BRI. I think the BRI will the term will be used for years, I don't know how long, but then they will have something new into this concept. In Chinese, we say we use the old bottle to contain the new wine. So this will continue. And so in the future, that's my prediction. I think China will emphasize and to develop a economic cooperation in all fields under the name BRI. That's the new trend.
Understood. Thank you. Abha?
So I'll keep it short. What I would say is that, firstly, no infrastructure project is devoid of political contention as to, what is the strategic importance to which country and who's the winner and who's the loser. And secondly, I would just say that that infrastructure alone is not going to take us to uplifting 30% of the world out of poverty. So what is needed is the trade which follows, as you said, and the institutions and policies around it. And I think, I would just focus on, if we could mitigate the three big risks of BRI, then BRI could have tremendous opportunities in terms of interconnectivity, the amount of impact it will make on the number of countries, the number of people, and it has huge scope. And I would just also say that, but BRI still doesn't cover all of the world, so we do need to see smaller interregional cross-boundary projects.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Chipman, Mrs. Joshi-Ghani, and Dr. Yang Xuetong for your insights and thoughtful discussion. I'm sure I speak for the whole panel when I say very much we appreciate the questions from the audience. That's always where we get our best content. It's evident that international infrastructure projects have a wide swath of objectives for developers and many impacts for the host countries. The BRI initiative is ambitious, history-making, and a formidable challenge to see to completion. For all international projects, the critical areas that require the full, concentrated, and coordinated attention are governance, political risk management, and an agreed best practices template. A global community would benefit from a coalescing of thoughts and best practices into a supranational monitoring organization. I know from experience that a larger global context and interconnectedness is part of the solution to global infrastructure development. Thank you.